Welcome to this session on We Did It Our Way, Europe's Science and Innovation Model Revisited. My name is Helen Cheresky. I'm a physicist and oceanographer, and as someone from the UK, I am eternally grateful. Every year I turn up here, and every year the discussions go, we think the UK is part of Europe, and I'm so grateful, because we want to be. Okay, so in the first session this morning, we heard about the practical approaches to the present moment, the start of the next framework program, FP10, excuse me, and the geopolitics that's shaping the science and innovation in the European landscape. But in this session, we're going to take a bit of a breath. We're going to take a step back from the immediate practicalities, and we're going to think a little bit more about the big ideas behind all of this, the history and the philosophy and the context for how science fits into society. And there is a lovely bit of history here, and I'm sure many of you will know this, but around the year 1800, there were two brothers who were extremely influential in the world of European science. The younger brother, Alexander von Humboldt, was a naturalist who explored the world and really explored the connections in nature, and wrote an extremely influential series of books that sought to unify knowledge across branches of science. And then his older brother Wilhelm took a university role, and he re-envisaged I can't even speak my own language, I'm sorry, and you're all speaking your third language, I'm sure, re-envisioned education, so creating a holistic view of what education is for, and this idea that having an understanding of how the world works is something that's important for all citizens. And so their joint legacy is the foundation of the European science model, the way things work today. But is this curiosity-driven approach enough? How should we think about societies addressing complex challenges in difficult times? And especially the thing that we're going to be exploring in the next 45 minutes or so is whether the philosophical ideal that European science has, perhaps, is that still working? Does it need re-examining? How should we think about it? Should we talk about it more? What should it be? These are the questions that we will be looking at, along with what the future of the social contract between science and society might be. So, joining me to discuss all this are my three very distinguished guests here. Down at the far end there, we have Lydia Borrell-Damian, who is the Secretary General of Science Europe. In the middle, we have Robert Jitgraff, who is the President-elect of the International Science Council, and of course, who was the former Minister of Science in the Netherlands. And next to me here, we have Sheila Jasanoff, who is the Professor of Science and Technology Studies, and actually a founder of that field, who is based at Harvard University. So the way this will work is the same as the others. We will have a discussion on stage for the next 35 or 40 minutes, and then we will have questions at the end. And I'm sure none of you would be the person that gives the very long comment and doesn't ask a question, but I'm just saying it, just in case. We do like short questions and even preceded by even shorter comments. So do keep that in mind when you're fomenting your ideas. You can have the longer discussion in the tea break afterwards. Okay, so to get started then, Sheila, we heard this morning that there is this idea about science being a good model of science is to drive it by curiosity. And that's, if you let the scientists follow their nose, they're going to find interesting things, and that's a sensible way to progress. How unusual is that in history?
Well, it kind of depends where you want to start history and whether you want to go back to people like Daedalus and, the contributions he made, which to this day remain sort of axiomatic for science and technology, were driven very much not by his curiosity, but by his patrons' desire for utility. So I think that the point is not to, in the situation we're in, is not to idealize and purify and distill and act as though any of these systems or models have been one thing or another. I do think that the emphasis has been laid in different places at different times. And of course, in this meeting, we're talking about this very strange construct called Europe, which has also been called an unidentified political object. So, while we're talking about European science policy, we're also talking about the construction of Europe as a particular kind of thing. If you go to CERN, or at least when I last visited it, there was a celebration of curiosity-driven research as the underpinnings of that enterprise. But I think that it serves Europe to act as if there's a universalist humanist principle that is bringing together this otherwise strange conglomerate of 26 countries that actually have very different ideas of what should be driving science or not. But coming to what I know intimately and well, the US, there is no single model of science and society driving the US. I've spent all of my life in only Ivy League institutions, but divided approximately, 40% at Cornell and 60% at Harvard. And those are two extremely different models for how to fund universities and what is expected of them. So Cornell, although it's part of the Ivy League, is public and private at the same time. It combines under its own single institutional roof a very utilitarian American approach from the end of the Civil War period that funded university research through land-grant universities in order to produce research that was of utility to agriculture and the military. So those were about as, and we were talking about dual use this morning, right? I mean, so it's about as utilitarian a set of objectives as possible. And then there was this man who made his fortune, Ezra Cornell, by actually serving Alexander Graham Bell with his ceramic enterprise, creating the nodes on top of the telegraph lines. But he was, he favored, if you will, curiosity-driven research. So the university came into being through this private infusion of money that was non-utilitarian, and this public infusion of money that was quite utilitarian, and produced an entity which to this day has not sorted out even within its own walls what it is. So I think that if one is going to become historical about these things, one should also, in the contemporary world, become ecological in a sense and think about the different ecologies of knowledge making, and ask questions like, does one ecosystem at a given moment in time, like this very disturbed one we're in, offer models of resilience, robustness? This is a theme that came up in the last panel in this room, and I would love to know what my colleagues think about these kinds of issues.
Brilliant. That's a great start, and I certainly learned something about Cornell that I didn't know before. Going back to these big ideas, Lydia, on a very sort of, you're in rooms with people, funders, discussing science day to day. How much do they think about having a guiding philosophy? When you're at the cutting edge and you're sort of planning, you're doing the nuts and bolts of it, how much are people aware of the guiding ideas behind all of this?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I'm speaking here from the point of view of national research funding organizations and research performing organizations. They are very conscious of the philosophy underpinning their own policies and programs, absolutely. And when in the Science Europe platform that we offer for dialogue with them, that is an absolute must. They have, every organization of course have their national priorities, but when they come to the Science Europe table, they really think European. And that is, I think, is to celebrate, because when you think about all these countries in Europe that despite all the difficulties managed to break all the barriers, and at least in our field, in the name of science, they really let their differences set aside to construct something together. That is, I think, very recent historically, because of course we know of all the tremendous pasts of wars of Europeans killing each other all the time. So I think the fact that as a result of the Second World War, one of the good outcomes of that war was that this sense of unity and starting this construct that has been so difficult over the years. But when you look at the level of dialogue that is happening now, I think that it is amazing what Europe has been building and achieving. Despite all, and we are not perfect, I'm not saying this, but I am focusing here on the value that we all bring together. And science is no exception. Science is also about bringing value together. We complain about perhaps that the European science is not at the same level that other parts of the world. But if we didn't have a framework program, if we didn't have a Marie Curie program, ERC program, all these programs, it would be much worse, because we cannot achieve individually of every country what we are achieving together. So to me, this is very well known in the research community, and I think it is worth to foster. And we are now on situation where, due to the geopolitical problems, we could break that sense of community altogether. So I think we need to renew the efforts to keep the dialogue happening, because it's the only way. First of all, there is a utilitarian concept, if you want that, is the only way that we can be still competitive. At the same time, the underlying philosophy, as you said, is what kind of society we want for the future. Do we want a society that focuses exclusively on competitiveness, or that we want a construct altogether to benefit society as a whole?
So I really like that framing of, between the things both of you said, that there's lots of different ways of doing things, but if you have a unifying idea, there is still something that unifies, even though you do things in different ways. Robert, I wanted to move on a little bit to this idea of the social contract between science and society, because you did go from the world of science into the murky world of politics. You've seen the way politicians deal with these debates. What do you think is happening to this often unspoken social contract? I mean, we've heard it this morning, there should be science for the public good, but how do politicians view that? What's the external view on that?
Well, first of all, wonderful to be here, and I think it's a really important issue that we perhaps haven't discussed enough, because it's actually also an uncomfortable conversation. I think, we all agree how important science is, whether it's for just following our curiosity, for economic benefit, from societal benefit, and I think we should also say that, the past 80 years, we had this kind of unspoken social contract where citizens would provide tax money, and we would have this rapidly, almost exponentially growing scientific enterprise that we built, worldwide, with all our institutions, our research universities, our funding agencies, etc. And I think now we are at a moment where we have to see that there are the support base for all of this is being eroding, it's being fragmented, and there are fault lines in society, and often, unfortunately, educational fault lines that create polarized society, where some part of society is no longer seeing those benefits. We've always positioned science as a public good, actually a global public good, so we all benefit, new medicines, new technologies, new insights that you can teach in schools. And so there's something happening here that I think we have to address, because it's underpinning everything that we want from science, and from political perspective, I've seen that there is not a single issue, I think, being discussed in politics that doesn't demand a serious contribution of science. But it also complicates things, the question is, how do we navigate that interaction between science and society, and science and politics? There is this phrase, if you mix science with politics, you get politics. I think, why, perhaps a bit naive, I would think, isn't it wonderful if all our policies are underpinned by scientific evidence, etc. But then certainly you're being accused of, as a scientist, of being politicized. So I think there's a whole series of things happening. And I like to quote, actually misquote, the Nobel Prize winner Steven Weinberg. He said once, in science we usually learn about nature, But sometimes in science, we learn about science. And I feel this is a wake-up moment. I think, you know, a lot of stresses on the system, so we're in this interesting situation where the demands on science are increasing. We are all incredibly optimistic of what we can achieve, but there is a certain risk we lose popular support. And clearly we see this very dominantly in the US, but unfortunately, I've seen the same forces at play in Europe, in the Netherlands. I've heard people in parliament say exactly the same things, and even also trying to make it into concrete, I would say, punishable proposals, punishing proposals. And so this is something I think that, you know, as a scientific community, we have to reckon with.
And it does involve self-reflection, as you say, like what is it we're actually trying to do and why. Sheila, you
and if
said,
I, by the way, can say that the wonderful thing is that we have people like Sheila. There are fields in academics that actually study this. And so the good thing is that all these questions can be debated and discussed, and there's a lot of insights that can be brought forward to address those issues.
I do think, I mean, this is a slight side issue, but I do think it's very, not all scientists are necessarily comfortable with being studied themselves. I was once on a research ship off Iceland, and there was a social scientist on the ship studying us doing ocean science. And every time anyone did anything, she sort of got out a little notebook and started writing. But it was a really interesting process. Like, none of us had thought that we might have norms and cultures in what we were doing. But the little notebook would come out, 6 weeks in when everyone's gone a bit mad. Anyway, so Sheila, you said in your the piece you wrote for the summit brochure that science could be framed as an ongoing expression of society's best interest. Could you unpack that a little bit for us?
How much time are you going to give me?
Unpack it in a relatively concise way.
I'm not sure that I specifically want to get at it that way. I do want to come back to the social contract, which obviously in a very general way relates to the question that you're asking, Helen. So for a long time, I mean, since I do study science policy and wrote, I think, the first book ever on scientific advisory committees that was actually an academic study of these entities, the idea of the social contract was not debated in most places. I mean, most people in America, if you said social contract, they would point you to Vannevar Bush's Science, the Endless Frontier, and that's often taken as the origin story of there even being a concept of a social contract between science and society in America, partly because what Bush was trying to do was preserve something that I think is widely agreed in this room is a must, which is the flow of public funds to the doing of research. I mean, I actually do believe in that as well, but with less accountability than most institutions that are in the business of spending public tax dollars. So, you know, what Bush had, Vannevar Bush now, not one of the Georges, had observed during World War II was that there was a danger of science being completely co-opted by the public mission and having to be completely accountable, therefore, to public authorities. And the whole idea of inventing a space called basic science, which later came to be called curiosity-driven research and a whole number of other things, was to create the conceptual space for a kind of autonomy that where scientists would be able to have these things that they call independent advisory bodies and so on and so forth. I mean, the truth is that there was never any such thing as independence. That too is a kind of construct, that there can be more or less degrees of accountability and autonomy and bureaucracy. I mean, obviously, one can play around with those kinds of variables. But anyway, I never heard of Europeans talking about the social contract. I wrote a book in 2005, I think, called Designs on Nature, in which I talked about the fact that, comparatively speaking, there was a different social compact in Europe as opposed to America in this 3-country study that I was doing on biotechnology. So it's interesting to me to see this word now appearing on the European side of the discourse. And I think it's partly because we're talking about this thing called Europe. And I would really love to hear more about what is gained by elevating the science policy discourse into a thing about Europe, partly because Europe is a federation, the US is a federation. Within the US now we're seeing a disunity, a falling apart of the idea that the space where there used to be agreement, right or left, whichever side of the aisle you were on, the one place you agreed on was how much money NIH should spend, give or take, how much money NSF should spend, give or take. And that consensus is dying down. Okay, and one of the reasons it's dying down is that people no longer believe that more knowledge leads to more benefits for society. I think in the 21st century, there have been two big shocks to the public, the sort of lay public understanding of the relationship between more knowledge and more public benefit. One is climate. More knowledge has brought a sense that there will be more constraints, more limits on the ways in which you should live your life, that sustainability means transitioning to other ways, looking out for other people's interests, not your own, and so on. I mean, so it's a constraining move. And then, of course, COVID, which was the largest unconsented biological experiment humanity has ever undertaken, and it's not surprising that the response to a year and a half of that has been to say, on what authority, on what epistemic authority did you conduct that experiment? And frankly, I think that our public health authorities and our scientific authorities have been astonishingly bad at explaining good public health decisions because they've retreated to this purist, well, science told us this. Science didn't tell us that. Science plus judgment told us a set of things, but we haven't been able to communicate that thing very well. So, I think that the idea that put more money into knowledge making, by some magical alchemical means that'll produce more industry, more goods, more jobs, and everything will be expanding, has not actually been true in these two cases. And I think that that's something that we have to live with and figure out how to work ourselves out of if we're going to go forward with something that I think all of us profoundly believe in, that there should be a free space for human inquiry, that human inquiry is not something that we can stop dead in its tracks, that, whatever this thing called post-truth is, that we need to wrap our minds around it and, talk in a more intelligent way about the world that we're actually confronting today. So the relationship between politics and science, I think, is front and center for us to talk about. And Robert, I am touched that you say it's a great thing there are people like me, but after 45 years of working away at this, I have only built one department, and it remains the only department devoted to this study.
I think in defense of my own university, I think UCL has a Department of Science and Technology Studies, do they not? Is that what you're talking about? UCL, yeah.
I'm not talking about England, but even in England, it's astonishing that Cambridge and Oxford do not.
Fair enough. So there was a lot in that. There was a point at the start about whether a European model is a thing. Would either of you like to defend? Yes, Robert, go on.
Yeah, because I didn't touch it. So I think actually it's really interesting to have to take this kind of broader view. What is the European model and what are its strengths and weaknesses? So I think, there are certain elements in the European model which might be perceived as weaknesses that actually could turn out as strength. So I like to, so the complexity and the inertia of the European processes, when turned around, they create stability and predictability for science. So we're debating a next framework program. It's a 7-year budget. That's for many national governments' perspective is infinity. I know when I started as a minister, I was told that the average lifespan of a European minister is 22 months, and might have gone down in the past few years, I think. So there is the element, another element, I think, which really is strength of Europe is its kind of open nature. As a European Union has grown, but if you think about that, we have now 20 countries that are associate members, perhaps soon more. So there is this kind of I would say, kind of a gradient model where you have various rings of collaboration. And I think, again, that's a particular nature of the ecosystem that has its strengths and weaknesses. And I think it's really interesting to see what the resilience of that system is. Obviously, the political volatility of a community of 27 member states is less than that of one individual member state. So there's some kind of damping that actually is beneficial to science. There is the plurality that's in the system. So science might be universal, but the way science institutions and scientific culture has been grown is historically dependent, and they're very, very different. And then finally, I think there's a tradition in Europe that I think we have to revive, is being open for other cultures and other influences. That has worked really well in the past. So I think it's good, at least, for science itself, that we don't have one worldwide uniform community, but we have these kind of different kind of ecosystems that I think each have their strengths and weaknesses. And I think in terms of geopolitical perspectives, in some sense, Europe is certainly in a position where I think it has to kind of deliver on its strength. And I think that's what you also were saying, that we have to be very careful that if we make the case for science, that there is truth in advertising. And that's kind of a serious point, but we have to do this. If we try to convince voters and citizens that we are able to solve their problems, that we are able to generate economic growth, that science and education are a way to make the differences smaller, then we actually have to do this. And I think this is again a moment where science had to look in the mirror and ask the question, are we doing a good job?
So we had, let's stick on, I think it's interesting that, this session was set up as, a little bit of, almost as though there's a tension between curiosity-driven science and utility-driven science. But it seems that the place we're getting to is actually the bigger third part in this is the public and society and what society expects. And so, Sheila, just to stay on that point for a minute, what about the way science talks to society about what it does? Because there's a two-way thing, isn't there? There's a kind of, you can set up a philosophy and that might filter down through the funding systems to scientists, and you set a big philosophy. But at some point, something down there has got to get back to the public. And what we're hearing now is that the public have to be on board with this, perhaps in a way that they didn't 20 years ago. What's your view of how this links to how does society fit into this triangle?
Well, it fits completely, of course, because society is, in the end, mostly funding research. As you said, I like the way you put it, Robert, like unspoken social contract. I think is a very good sentence, because it does reflect a little bit the tension between the society and the investment in research and in higher education, if I can make also include a word on that in this debate. So I think that communicating science is one of the most difficult things, that we have now in the scientific community, because we tend to communicate the success of science only, and when there is a breakthrough event that is a cure for a certain illness. And that then is presented as that's what a marvelous work the scientists are doing. But of course, we all know that science is, by most of it, is incremental. And when you get to that breakthrough, it is because there has been hundreds or thousands of researchers doing something that has enabled that breakthrough. But that is completely unknown to the public. So the scientific process itself, the internal validations, the peer review, the failures, and the capacity to take a research piece that has been forgotten and then revamp it and make it something successful, that's completely unknown to the public. So I think that this is one thing that research funders, research organizations should take more on board, to communicate science not at the end of a process, and normally is a successful process, but also right from the start to make understand the citizens the methodologies. There are some very honorable examples already. If you look at the patients' communities that are in direct contact with the doctors that are in research, these guys, with their tremendous illnesses, are able to share with doctors who really listen to them and really make them understand the processes and what's going inside their body. So I'm not saying that we should all do this example, but it's just to illustrate the point that communicating science is something very laborious, not always rewarded at the level that it should be in scientific careers. And this is just a hint to how we assess researchers and how we assess research institutions in their progress. So there is, I think, a reconceptualization of how we communicate science, what's the place of the communication of science in the system. And we need to engage citizens' communities in there. I recently spoke to a researcher in an organization that had received a collection of students who were all against, for example, the use of animals in animal testing. And you know that scientific community is making a lot of effort to precisely reduce the use of animals in research. But these guys were really convinced that you should ban completely the use of animals in research. And this guy, with infinite patience, showed them the consequences of today stopping completely the test in research. And he managed to make those youngsters open their mind. And this is what we should be looking at, people opening their minds to be receptive to the messages that come from science. Super laborious, but super important.
But there's something very interesting in what you've just said, actually. That example of the patients, for example, talking to doctors, that is a situation where I don't think you can separate what's curiosity-driven and what is utility-driven. Because if there's something happening to your body, and it's your body, right? You're curious. But at the same time, you also want to get well. And that's the place where I see these two philosophical ideas overlap the most, is once you touch a community, whether it's a user community, whether it's a doctor, it's the difference between curiosity-driven research and utility-driven research becomes very narrow. Sheila, just to come back to this idea of the sort of models behind things, we're talking about science as though it's all one big thing, right? But, you know, there's people like me who study bubbles in the ocean, and there's people working on AI and quantum technologies, and there's all these different areas of science, and some of these have long-term benefits and short-term benefits. Do we have a need? Like, how does it work? How do the models work for different areas of science? I mean, instead of having some big philosophy, do we need different philosophies or models for different areas of science, depending on what we want to do?
Yeah, well, scientists love to boil everything down into models, but modeling society isn't all that easy either. I do think a different kind of training is needed for scientists. So it's astonishing how the science communication discussions in scientific meetings are dominated by scientists' understandings of what it is that needs to be communicated, and the parables, the success stories, almost always end up with the public being persuaded, as in your case, to abandon their wrong-headed ideas of why one shouldn't be doing some kinds of research and come around to the right ways of thinking. So we're living in a moment in which the decades of extremely responsible, important climate change research in America are being pulled down, right? Data sets stopped in their tracks, machines being allowed to rot, and, actually private parties having to go in and rescue things that used to belong to federal agencies because DOGE came along and suddenly put an end to things. So, it's a kind of bloodism, if you will, or, certainly a form of rebellion that I don't think climate scientists coming forward and explaining what's so great about climate research would have been the answer. I mean, something was brewing for longer, was gaining ferocity over a much longer period of time. Now, I think that I'd go back to Robert's little throwaway comment about false advertising. I mean, so I think science, in carving out the space for curiosity-driven or basic research, has promised to find solution to societal problems. But as science's capacity to predict has increased, particularly in the computerized world, science has actually got better at identifying problems. And if you identify the problem and then put yourself in the position of solving it, that's very different from society identifying a problem and the scientists solving it. So there's a little tiny passage in a very noted history of medicine that says that when polio vaccine was discovered and its reliability established, church bells rang across America. And I take that as a kind of metaphor for society agreeing that this was, a benefit that we put up with. But even polio vaccine is threatened today, right? Under RFK Jr.'s tutelage of the National Institutes of Health and governmental health policy. So how can it be that such a situation has come about? Well, in between, we've had COVID vaccine, which is a solution to a problem that the public didn't all agree was a problem. I mean, maybe they should have agreed that it was a problem, but the fact is, for whatever reason, it has been reread in very recent history as a problem created by science, to which science then, through the lobby of pharmaceutical industries and a speeded up clinical trial model that did not comport with anything that was already written down in regulatory law, essentially put an illicit product into the marketplace to fight an illicit problem that the public hadn't agreed was a problem. So, that is a construction of what science is doing in society that's radically different from people seeing their 3-year-old that was healthy yesterday and now being crippled for life, and then the vaccine coming along to save them. So, I think that it's science's own success at finding problems, in a sense, that has to be factored into this communication thing. And it's not just about why I do my research and the way I do it. Yes, that's important, but we've been doing that kind of communication for decades, and I don't think it has anything to do with the backlash, the intensity of the backlash against science that we're seeing now on my side of the Atlantic.
Is this not just a part of a more complex world? Because in a relatively simple world where, you had a relatively straightforward job, you knew the people in your village, and then the child dies of polio or becomes deformed because of polio, there's a simplicity in that. And I guess what you're saying about science identifying problems, it's also that you map out this much, much more complicated world which can be interpreted in very, very many ways. Do you have a brief response to that?
Just a very brief response to that is actually something I've been wanting to say in this audience that isn't a direct response to your question. So I've been struck all day at the fact that when Europe is looking at who to work with and who to compete or collaborate with, two things always come up: America and China. And I, of course, come from a different continent, as is obvious from looking at me. And I've wondered why that 1/6 of the world's population, which certainly contains a lot of global minds, doesn't come up in Europe's model of innovation, doesn't come up in a definition of what global minds might be, doesn't come up in, where the collaborations of the future that bypass troubled transatlantic alliances and troubled transcontinental alliances between Europe and the Far East might be. So I think that the complexity itself needs to be taken apart because we simplify in our own minds. There is a model of what science, innovation, and growth ought to be that makes Europe look at two reference points, the US and China. And I think that is a constraint in Europe's imagination, that it's not being complex enough. So my partial answer to your direct question is it the right kind of complexity that we in the science world are pushing for? And you know, one reason that I myself have become the American of choice in many European settings is that the Humboldt Foundation paid for my father to study in Germany between the years of 1933 and 1938. And before that, he had studied at LSE, and he went back to India after 11 years abroad, loving Germany, having seen it from 33 to 38, and despising England. And this is how I ended up in America, not England, and eventually got sent to Germany. So this is a long history of complexity in which you could say the Hamburg Stiftung actually fished for a global mind in a place that the British were not fishing at that time.
You remind me, go on, Robert, very quickly.
Very quickly, because I did mention, you know, if you think of Europe advantages, it's this open nature. And if you look at the 20 countries that are associated, which includes New Zealand, Canada, and I think there this idea of having various concentric rings, which is, you know, like-minded countries that are innovative. Basically, every country at some point probably wants to be innovatively oriented. In some sense, Europe can transcend its geography and becoming this more kind of metaphorical concept of a certain way of doing science, which is open, collaborative, and that, I think, offers great opportunities. So I think already we're moving in that direction.
Lydia, very quickly.
Yes, thank you, Sheila, for bringing up this discussion, this element of the international cooperation. But I want to make a difference between maybe the discourse in open policy discussions and what happens in reality. Because I know that at least the members of Science Europe, the national funding organizations and performing, they have collaborations with many, many countries over the world, and not only China and US or Japan and India. So there are many, many collaborations that are happening that maybe are not visible enough. What I would like to say is that there is an element that we Europeans need to pay a lot of attention, which is the reciprocity element, is the taking account of the indigenous knowledge that lies in these other societies. Increasingly, we see the voice of Latin America, the voice of Africa, the voice of Southeast Asia, raising up levels of dialogue in science that are not heard before. And that's, for me, a very positive development. But it is often a criticism, more or less expressed clearly, that Europeans may come too strong on managing those contracts, kind of imposing or at least telling the other how is best to do things. So we need to listen. We need to listen to those voices that say, hey, hello. We need to reappraise how we build international cooperation. And not just because you are on stage, but I know NWO from the Netherlands is gaining a reputation of being able to change that way. So it is, I think this is a trend we should look in Europe to see how best incorporate the knowledge lying in other regions and how best define collaborative international programs.
That you reminded me, Sheila, of at the European Geophysical Union meeting in March, which is the big sort of earth sciences conference. It's enormous. There was a sort of crisis meeting at the end this year, an extra session on the relationship between Europe and America. And the first person to ask a question after the panel discussion was a Brazilian PhD student who said, well, you're all talking about Europe and America. What about the rest of us, right? There's 2 whole continents, or 3 whole continents of people who have loads of ideas and they want to do science, and you're spending all your time talking about this country that doesn't want to do science. Well, let us in. That was basically her point. Okay, we are coming to questions very, very shortly. While you think of your questions, I've got one very quick, and I know you've got an answer to this that could take an hour, but you're going to do it in a minute, right? Before this all started, you said to me that you thought maybe science should change. Explain that to us.
Well, I said it's this kind of wake-up moment. So I think, all these issues that we talk about can be studied, and I think we should put some of our efforts not only in developing these new scientific methods, etc., but also studying these issues. How do we connect to policy and politics? How do we connect to society? How do we work with international collaborations? These are, important points to address if science wants to evolve. And I think part of it should also be look critically back in the past. And she made the point, some of these negative developments have been accelerated through the pandemic. So I think it also, in the honesty and transparency of science, we should also carefully look what went wrong, what could we have done differently. And I think this is a moment for, society is changing. I think as scientists, we hope that we can change society, but it takes a long time. But I think in the meantime, I think science to change so that it really is able to connect to society.
Brilliant. Okay, right, questions from the audience. We have a microphone at the back. If you've got a short question, maybe coupled to a tiny comment, please do put your hand in the air. We'll get a microphone to you, and I've scared you all now. No one's got any questions. Okay, one down at the front here.
Okay, Helmut Dosch, Hamburg, DC. Short question. Following your discussion on science communication to society, my question is, how do you see this challenge in times of social media?
That is a whole other session, but go on, let's have a go. Social media, what do we think about this? Go on, Robert.
So I'm kind of fundamentally optimistic. So I feel that this is a new communication channel that obviously doing a lot of harm, but I think can also be used as a positive force. So I think, if we think about how we communicate to the world, we have to be aware of what the various communication channels are. Clearly, some of it has to be regulated, so perhaps we can stop some of the negative, the fake news, etc. But I think, we should also study how we can use it, to reach people, because honestly, the fact that basically anybody in the world can be reached now with any kind of information, clearly dis and misinformation, but also scientific knowledge. So I think there's tremendous opportunities for us.
Penetrate the echo chambers.
Well, and one thing I feel, and that this is a little bit related to this question, what should we do? I think, there's certainly a group of society that we want to communicate with, which is probably an uncomfortable conversation, but it's not a uniform group. So there are probably various layers. There might be a hardcore that's very difficult to reach, but I think there are layers that are much easier to reach, and I think we should just do it, and we should have, if you just can spend, say, 1% of all our creativity and energy that we do science in thinking about smarter ways to reach those people, I think it would have tremendous benefit.
Any other quick comments on social media, Sheila?
One can talk about regulating, but I think that what we have here is an extremely powerful force that's addictive, that's similar to things like opioid drugs. And one of the things you need to do is change people's own understandings of responsible behavior with that. So it's not only what exogenous regulation looks like, it's also how people get taught to behave with this medium. People, I shouldn't be saying this in Germany, but on the whole, most people think that you should not drive cars at any speed, whatever, and people have got used to that idea. In Germany, you control it by making the Autobahns so crowded that you actually cannot exercise your free speed rights. But in any case, I mean, it's a little like that. I mean, social media discussions for a long time have focused on governmental regulation, GDPR, privacy rules, etc., and not at all on what human subjects should be doing with this very powerful addictive technology.
Go on, Lydia.
Thank you. Yes, my comment to that, thank you for the question, is that there is also a link here with communication specialists that needs to be built stronger, because social media can have a lot of advantages, a lot of inconveniences. What they have in common is that especially the young generations, like these very short captures sentences that super simplify reality. and science is everything about super simplification. So I think that the way we need to evolve is to find ways to communicate that nothing is as easy as it seems, and be able to go deeper. And it doesn't have to be rocket science, which is absolutely complex. Take a historian, take a social scientist. Their high insights come from very profound analysis. And it cannot just be told that it requires explanation. So I think that social media should be used also to explain the complexity of science, and that not everything can be just summarized in 140 characters.
Okay, I've got opinions about this, but I'm going to keep quiet. Right, so who else? What other questions have you got out here? Yes, one in the middle here. Yes, microphone's just coming.
I mean, the focus of this really in terms of, innovation model that we have, and one sentence that sort of jumped out at me, yet Europe faces a notorious underperformance in translating scientific discovery into marketable innovation, yeah? And that really comes to the point of what is funding our science for what purposes. I would say, being a researcher in Germany, having spent time in Helmholtz or Fraunhofer, we have varieties. Within Europe, we have various calls targeting different aspects. I have actually a fairly positive sense of this, but I'm coming away from this panel discussion that it's sort of gloomy and that we're sort of losing innovative potential. Is that the case? How are we utilizing sort of the funding that we have and targeting the right KPIs in terms of having enough IP and incentives for spin-offs, but still allowing sort of the creative, inspired science for the sake of science? Where do you see it actually sitting right now, sort of that balance of innovative marketability versus creativity?
Who's going to go on that? Yeah, Lydia, go on.
I can start. Well, that's opening a Pandora's box in a way. I am optimistic as you. I don't think the gap is so dramatic, but I do think that the policies fostering innovation, they can perhaps be changed to be focusing more on favoring entrepreneurial mindset in the younger generations, without compromising the funds for research. I think there is a little bit of a misunderstanding that there is a pot of money and that that pot of money is fixed and it has to be shared between innovation and investment in basic research. I think we should move away from that because we need to ensure that basic research continues and is very well fundamented, because at the end is at the origin of the innovation. So I think that we need to make, I know it's a continuum, but there is a clear frontier on when you generate innovation and what goes after, and how institutions support spin-offs, startups, etc. But I think that the fault, if we can talk like that, is not so much on the basic research, but is so much on the instruments that support the growth of innovative companies. Short answer to your question.
Sheila.
So in the days when Craig Venter split off from the National Institutes of Health in the US and formed Celera, there was an image of him that used to go around, one side clad in a white lab coat, the other side in a suit jacket. But I think that that captures a kind of person that is created in America, who's the hybrid entrepreneur and scientist. If you read Walter Isaacson's account of Jennifer Doudna's discoveries, you'll find very early on that what she did, that Emmanuel Charpentier did not do, actually, was start spinning off companies. And if you read the history of Silicon Valley, you will find that many of those people, who many of them were European transplants, did the spinning off. And I think I wrote one of the earliest articles on venture capital in the biotech industry. It came out in 1987, so that's pretty early on. And Germany's venture capital, in a sense, was the state. whereas America's venture capital was coming from the private sector, and it had very different dynamics attached to it. So it's in American scientists' DNA, helped along by the 1980 Bayh-Dole Act, that the inventor should also be an entrepreneur. And, you know, you just do not have that same ethos to the same degree. But I think one has to ask about the flip side as well. And I think that the fact that more than half of Americans' wealth is concentrated in half a dozen hands is a statement about equality and inequality that Pope Leo seems to understand, and I think we should in this room as well. He did say recently, what does it even mean to have a trillionaire, Elon Musk, right? I mean, so, you know, I think that we need to ask the redistribution side of the model of innovation / entrepreneurship and not only glorify the marketable qualities. Marketable to whom, for what purpose, and to whose benefit at the end of the day.
Robert.
Bravo. Yeah, I want to say something about this distinction between curiosity-driven basic research and innovation. So I think actually they are in essence the same. I think, you know, what is basic research? You know, it's say we have this kind of innate wonder of what, and imagination of what could be, and then the curiosity to find out. And I think that's an incredibly large driving force. And it's in some sense the same thing which moves entrepreneurs ahead. And I think, you know, if you can look at the stars and think, you know, what's the fate of the universe? And I think actually it's the same drive that make people to solve problems, of, you know, create a company, etc. So I think it's kind of this raw energy that I would say that every human being is born with, that we have to stimulate, etc. And we should kind of stop making these distinctions, because I think it's essentially the same thing.
But then, having said this is a discussion on philosophy, you still have to decide where to put your funding, right? There's still a hat that your funding, you know, you have to dress it up. Your funding has to come under some kind of idea umbrella, does it not? Or
you do, but and we all know the answer, you know, which is it's a kind of a smart portfolio where you have, you know, various kind of instruments, and I think, you know, it's important that we do all of it, but particularly I think, you know, that we do take as a society a certain amount of risk. You know, and it could be the risk in terms of chasing some kind of big scientific goal, or it could be the risk of starting a company. I think the thing that would really be bad is to do something in the middle, which is kind of boring, predictable, and of very little use. And we have to be clear that sometimes the incentives in the science as we know it in research infrastructure sometimes push you in that direction, I think. So I think it's much more important that we push people forward.
Okay, well, that is a great place to finish. We are out of time. Before you go off to the tea break, please join me in thanking our three fabulous panelists, Lydia Borrell-Domain, Robert Dickart, and Sheila Yasna. Thank you very much.